Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the first in a short series of videos that will be exploring government interventions. So this is all linked to 1.4 from the specification. Now hopefully what you remember is that there are three main market failures that you need to be aware about. We have public goods, and hopefully what you remember is that public goods are products which are both non-rival and non-excludable, and that gives way to the free rider problem. So in a free market economy, pure public goods would not be produced due to the inability for firms to generate profit. We've also looked at information gaps. So this is where a lack of information prevents consumers and producers from being rational in markets. So we're looking at asymmetric information, we're looking at imperfect information, and this can give way to both merit and demerit goods. We then also looked at externalities. So this is the idea that when firms and consumers buy and produce in markets, this can create bad and good impacts on third parties. So it would create impacts on people outside of that marketplace. So what we focused on would be negative externalities in production. So when firms produce, they create bad impacts on third parties. And we've also looked at positive externalities in consumption. So where the consumption of goods and services will create positive impacts on third parties. So the idea would be that public goods would be a market failure, and it would create a misallocation of resources because the free market economy would not produce these products. So all the benefits they offer to society would not exist. Information gaps lead to irrational behaviour, and that can lead to people consuming incorrectly, but it can also make it difficult for firms to produce correctly as well. And then externalities is where we're creating impacts on third parties. Now, negative externalities tend to be overproduced in a free market economy because the market will not internalise those external costs. Whereas positive externalities tend to be underconsumed because the market will not internalise the external benefits. It's therefore the role of the government to step into markets to fix these different market failures. So what you need to be aware about is that you will have to revise 8 different interventions for your exam. Okay, so we have indirect taxes, we have subsidies, we have maximum prices, minimum prices, regulation, we have tradable pollution permits, we also have state provision, and then finally we have information provision. Now, for the purpose of this video, what we're going to be focusing on is going to be the top 2. So I'm going to talk you through in this video how indirect taxes and subsidies can be used to correct market failures. Now, what I recommend that you do whilst you watch this video, you make some notes. So I'm going to talk you through the diagrams and think about how these different interventions can fix different market failures. Right, okay, so let's think first of all then about some indirect taxes. Now, hopefully what you remember is that an indirect tax is a tax that's placed on products within a marketplace. It's therefore a tax on expenditure, so a tax when people buy goods and services. This is an effective strategy to correct things such as demerit good market failure, but also negative externalities. Now, I want you to imagine in the diagrams below that the equilibrium point created by the free market economy is wrong. So we're in this red equilibrium point. Think about red as bad. So we don't want to be at this point here. We want to try and reduce the production and therefore the consumption of these negative externalities and demerit goods. So what we can do, we can impose a specific tax, which will be shown as a cost to the producer. So when it's a specific tax, it's going to create a parallel inward shift. Because what we're doing here, we're imposing a set amount tax for every unit of output sold. So it could be a 50p tax for every unit of output sold, etc. This will therefore mean the cost for the firm is the same regardless of the selling price of the product. But we can also have what we call an ad valorem tax, which is a percentage of the selling price as a tax. This would therefore mean the higher the selling price, the higher the tax will be on the business. That will therefore create a non-parallel shift. Now, the vertical distance between the supply curves is measuring the tax per unit. Okay. Now look at the impact this will have on the market. Now I'm going to think about green as good. So remember, red is bad, green is good. What the indirect tax will do, it will create a new market equilibrium point, such as this. So what you can see is these taxes will raise the selling price in markets, and that would lead to a contraction in demand. So the higher price would lead to people buying fewer of these different goods and services. So what you can see here, hopefully, is that this is an effective way at correcting a misallocation of resources. If we want to reduce consumption and production of a good in a marketplace, maybe to lower demand for demerit goods or to cut the production and consumption of negative externalities, these taxes can be really, really effective. Now, what we can then do with this diagram, though, as well, we can identify how much tax revenue will be generated for the government. So we start off at the new equilibrium point, that orange blob there. We then go vertically down to the original supply curve at that new selling price, and that will give us the tax per unit. And that will be applied to all of the output produced in the marketplace. Now, if I just complete this rectangle, the orange rectangle there will measure the tax revenue generated for the government. What we can then do, show it on the other side as well. So remember, that is the tax per unit, the orange line. That is applied to all of the output, and that will give us the tax revenue. Now, what we can now do is to identify the consumer tax and the producer tax. So what we'll do some different colours to make it stand out. So we're going to assume that yellow is the consumer tax. So the consumer will pay the proportion of the tax, which is the increase in price. So that will be that top section of that tax revenue. The producer will therefore have to pay the remaining part of it, and that will be the bottom section of that rectangle. So what we're measuring here, everyone, is something that we call the incidence of tax. So we're looking at who pays that tax that's imposed in markets. Now you can see here that roughly the tax is split equally between the consumer and the producer. This is because here the demand is roughly price unitary. So the tax will be split fairly equally between the consumer and producer. Now if we look at these two diagrams though, we can see here a price inelastic demand and a price elastic demand. Now look at the difference here. Now if I was to impose a specific tax, roughly the same in both of these two diagrams. Now again, what this will do, it will have the desired effect of cutting consumption of these negative externalities or these demerit goods, which is therefore correcting the market failure, and it's doing that by raising the prices from P1 to P2. But look at the difference here. Now in that first diagram, you've hopefully identified that the demand here is price inelastic. On the right hand side, you've got a price elastic demand. I want to delete that quickly. So you've got a price elastic demand. Now look at the difference then. When the demand is price elastic, the tax is much more effective at reducing the demand for this product than it would be if the demand is price inelastic. So you would argue, therefore, that if you were placing an indirect tax on demerit goods or negative externalities as a way of reducing consumption, well, the tax is far more effective if the demand is elastic than inelastic. So you might argue that when demand is inelastic, the tax is relatively ineffective. Now let me show you again what this will therefore do to the incidence of tax. So again, what we do, we start off at the new equilibrium point. We go vertically down to the original supply curve at that new price level, and that will show us the tax per unit. If I then complete that rectangle, we get the tax revenue generated. Same thing on this diagram. Vertical distance to the new quantity is the tax per unit. That is applied to all of the output level there. And we get this rectangle here. Now look what I did in the previous diagram. Yellow and red. Yellow, consumer tax. Red was producer tax. When demand is price inelastic, the consumer will pay those taxes. So you can see that when the demand's inelastic, the firm is confident that they can pass on the bulk of that tax onto the consumer. Whereas when the demand is elastic, the firm will have to absorb the majority of that tax. So the producer tax will therefore be very small when demand's inelastic and very big when demand is price elastic. Okay, right, now I'm going to show you now a more complicated diagram. What we're going to build up first of all is negative externalities in production. Now in this diagram here, this green equilibrium point is what we call the optimal output. It's at that point where we maximize economic welfare in the economy. So P star Q star is where you want the market to be. If the market operates there, then there is no market failure at all. This will always occur when the marginal social benefits are equal to the marginal social cost. So this is the point where we maximize welfare in the marketplace. Now the problem is that when firms produce in a free market economy, they're in it for profit. Now that's not the problem in its own right, but remember, to work out profit, you've got to look at the revenue that firms generate and take away their costs. So firms in theory will want to keep their costs as low as possible. So what firms will pay for are private costs. So these are the costs of producing goods and services such as labour, capital, land, enterprise. So it's paid for all the different factors of production they've got to buy to produce goods and services. Remember, M stands for marginal. So as production increases, they'll have extra private costs they've got to pay for. So for example, to produce a high level of output, you'll need more workers and you might need more land resources as well. But what firms will not consider when they produce are the external costs or the negative externalities. So for example, when a factory produces output, they in theory will not factor into their costs the impact they have on the environment through the pollution, the impacts they have on the health of local residents. They won't consider the impact they have on visual pollution or noise pollution, etc. So those are bad impacts which will lower the welfare of third parties. But when firms produce these products, they will not consider these external costs. So they will base supply only on the private costs. So look at that then. The supply technically is moved outwards. So their costs of production are lower than what they should be. Now what this will then mean is this, that the market equilibrium point will instead be at this point here. So because the firm's not having to pay for their external costs, their costs of production are lower than what they should be. And this will create an overproduction problem in this market. So you've got here the misallocation of resources. In other words, you've got what the market failure would be. Now, to correct this problem then, what we need to do is to introduce an indirect tax. So what we can do is this. Let's use a purple line to show it. We've got to try and shadow price, which is about trying to place a monetary value on the external costs. So the government's got to try and work out financially what is the financial hit of all those external costs that have been created in the marketplace. And then what we then say to the firm is, right, okay, now we've worked these out, we're going to internalise those external costs. In other words, we're going to make you pay for them through a tax. And if we get this right, what we can do, we can make the marginal private costs shift inwards to this point here. So what we've done here, we've added the tax onto the firms. That will raise their cost of production. Now look what that will then do. It will create a market equilibrium point at P star Q star, and we've therefore corrected the overproduction of negative externalities. Now everybody, if I were thinking about summarising then indirect taxes, let's think about what's good and what's bad about them. Well, a big benefit of these things will be straight away that what it does, it will internalise external costs. So it's making firms pay for the problems that they create, making the market consider those bad impacts they have on third parties. So that's a good thing. And then, of course, with that money, we can then compensate the third parties. We can use that money generated to raise the welfare of those people that have been badly affected by those external costs. Now, also, what it will also, in theory, do is to correct that misallocation of resources. So it's going to reduce production and consumption and therefore mean that less external costs will therefore be created. That's a good thing. Now, on top of that as well, it raises tax revenue for the government. Now, obviously, that could be used to compensate the people that have been badly affected by these external costs, or it could be a vital source of government money which can be used to provide positive externalities or merit goods. This could, for example, be more healthcare, more education, more funding for environmental policies. Now, what we do know is there are some problems of them. And we saw it in the earlier diagrams that these taxes are pretty ineffective if demand equals price inelastic. So if the demand for these products are price inelastic, then it will not have a significant impact on demand. Okay, so the market would remain fairly large still, and it therefore wouldn't reduce significantly the external cost created because production has not fallen by enough. Now, the next problem is the difficulty of shadow pricing. In other words, trying to place a financial value on all of those external costs is very, very difficult to do. So you've got to work out, well, how big should the tax be? What is the financial impact of pollution on local residents? What is the financial impact of people of that noise? Now, if we can't place values on these different things, it's very difficult to work out how much tax that market should pay. So that could lead to the market paying too high a tax or too low of a tax. Okay, so you've got there, everyone, indirect taxes. Right, what we now want to think about is subsidies. Now, remember, a subsidy is a grant normally given to firms as a way of reducing their cost of production. It's therefore designed to correct positive externality market failure, but also to raise consumption of merit goods as well. So the misallocation of resources this time on the red equilibrium point in this diagram is that we're under consuming and under producing these products. So what we want to do is to make these products more popular. So if we were to give the firm a subsidy, it would lower the cost of production. Now, the vertical distance between the supply curves would measure the subsidy per unit. And we can see that what this subsidy will do, it would lower the cost of production, which would in turn create a new market equilibrium point at P2, Q2. So as prices fall, we're going to get an extension in demand, and that's going to raise the consumption of these positive externality products. So that means there'll be more third-party benefits created, but also if it's a merit good, it's raising consumption which will benefit the consumer more as well. So it's a great way of tackling a misallocation of resources. Now, what we can then do on this diagram, though, is to work out how much that subsidy will cost the government. So what we got, we start off at the new equilibrium point. We go vertically up between the two supply curves at that point there, and that measures the subsidy per unit. And that will then be applied to all of that output. So the orange rectangle is the subsidy cost to the government. In other words, it's showing us how much money that will cost the government to provide that subsidy in that marketplace. Now, what I can then do is to show the impact of that subsidy on the consumer and the producer. Now, the consumer, first of all, will benefit from that proportion of the subsidy, because that is the proportion which has lowered the selling price in the marketplace. but the firm will also absorb some of that as extra profit. So the producer will benefit from that proportion of that subsidy. So remember, the subsidy will incentivise more production, so the firms must be able to make more profit by producing a bigger supply of this product. Let's now think about how effective subsidies actually are. So again, what we've got here is a price inelastic demand, and we've got a price elastic demand. Now what we can show is the impact of a subsidy. So again, they make the supply curve move outwards, and that will have the desired effect of lowering prices and therefore raising demand. Now what you can see here though is that the subsidy is far more effective at raising demand when demand is price elastic. If the demand is price inelastic, the impact of that subsidy will be fairly minimal on the market. It will have a significant impact on price, but it would not significantly raise the demand for the product. So if the goal of the subsidy is to raise consumption in the marketplace, it's going to be far more effective if the demand is price elastic. Right, now we're going to show this in a bit more of a complicated way now. So again, what we've got is our optimal output point. We want the market to operate at the green equilibrium point. That is where we maximise economic welfare. Now the problem is that when people consume, they will base demand only on their own private benefits. So those positive externalities will not be considered by the market, and that will therefore create a market failure at Q1, P1. And that will mean that all this extra welfare, this triangle here, will not be received by society. So if people thought about those external benefits and factored them into the decision making, the demand on the full social benefit curve rather than private benefits, and that additional welfare would be received by consumers. Now what we can do though is this. If we can work out the price points that people would demand Q star, we can introduce a subsidy to get people to that point there. So look at that blue demand line, that marginal private benefit curve. We're stuck here with that purple blob, but if we can lower the price to P2, then people will extend their demand to Q star. We're going to move down that demand curve. So what we can do is this. If we can give an appropriate subsidy to firms, which creates a new equilibrium point at P2 Q star, then we have fixed that market failure. We've raised the consumption up of this product, and we therefore get all that extra welfare in that marketplace. So again, it just shows how subsidies can correct that misallocation of resources. Now, last thing I want to sort of mention to you then, really overall, are the benefits and the drawbacks of subsidies. Now, think about the benefits of them first of all. Big benefit is it lowers production costs, and that will result in a reduction in prices, and it will raise demand. And if we're looking to raise the demand for merit goods and positive externalities, then that would allow more people to consume this product. You would also argue this will help people from lower income backgrounds to raise consumption. So maybe due to a lack of affordability, people from poorer backgrounds can't afford to demand merit goods or positive externalities. Well, if this makes them cheaper, it will raise the availability of these products for poorer people. So it could be a really, really good strategy to reduce income inequality as well. Improve access to essential goods and services for people from lower backgrounds. Now the problems though, it will create costs for the taxpayer. Okay, so that subsidy will have to be funded through raising taxes or taking money away from other parts of government spending, and that can carry an opportunity cost. It could mean that people have to pay higher taxes, or it could just mean that other parts of the economy, healthcare, education, flood defences, police, etc., will get less money. Now, we've also got the problem that it's ineffective if the demand is price inelastic. Now, it's good at lowering prices, so it still will help people from lower income backgrounds to buy these products. But if the overall goal was to significantly raise consumption, it won't have that impact if demand is inelastic. The firm will just benefit from and absorb most of that subsidy. And then the final problem is that problem of shadow pricing again. It's that difficulty of placing financial values on how big that subsidy should be. So, for example, with education, if people consume it, it would mean that we've got a more productive society. Well, what's the financial value of that? How big should that subsidy be? So again, it often means that subsidies might be too big or not big enough in a marketplace. Big problems for governments. Right, anyway, everyone, that is the end of that video. Hopefully you found that useful. So I'll